The sun was just beginning to rise over the bustling streets of Ouagadougou. The markets were opening, vendors setting out their wares, fresh fruits, dried fish, and the unmistakable smell of street food. Amidst the morning routine of the city, one man walked unnoticed among the crowd. His steps were deliberate, calm, yet he stood out in his simplicity. No suit, no bodyguards, just a plain shirt, brown trousers, and a cap pulled low over his eyes. President Ibrahim Traoré, the leader of Burkina Faso, moved through the crowd like a man who belonged to the people. He wanted to see the city as his citizens did, unfiltered, without the constraints of power and formality. His advisers would never have approved, but he had felt it in his gut. Something was off. The people were restless. The streets murmured with discontent. He needed to hear it for himself. "You can't trust the palace walls to tell you the truth," he had told his wife before leaving. She had warned him, of course, as she always did, her gentle voice filled with concern. "Be careful, my love. You have many enemies." He had smiled, kissed her forehead, and assured her, "I'll be back before sunset." As he walked, the noise of the market filled his ears. The chatter of the vendors, the laughter of children, the rhythm of everyday life, all of it felt like a world away from the pressures of office. Yet, amid the ordinary bustle, something caught his attention. A young boy, no older than 12, stood atop a small wooden box, a beat-up radio tied to a wooden stick. His voice, shrill and loud, cut through the noise. "Breaking news! The president's life is in danger! Traitors inside the government are plotting his death tonight!" the boy shouted. Traoré's heart skipped a beat. His guards, 2 trusted men dressed like ordinary citizens, didn't seem to notice the boy, but he did. He could feel the weight of the words in the pit of his stomach. He pushed through the crowd, trying to stay inconspicuous, though it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore the boy's frantic voice. A few people laughed, some threw coins into the boy's cup, but Traoré's eyes were fixed on the speaker. He approached the boy cautiously, standing beside him without drawing attention. "Where did you hear that news, son?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. The boy turned and eyed him curiously. "Who wants to know?" he asked, his voice suddenly serious. "It's not a joke, Uncle, I swear. I heard it on my radio last night. They're coming for the president. They said, 'Tonight's the night.'" The boy reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, battered tape recorder. It looked like something from a forgotten era. He pressed play. Static crackled before voices emerged, faint but clear. "The president must be gone before morning," one of the voices said. "He meets with the council tonight, and we have people inside. The guards will be ours." Traoré's blood ran cold. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was one of his own ministers, one who had once sworn loyalty to him. The boy looked up at him, waiting. Traoré's mind raced. He hadn't expected this, but now he knew the stakes were higher than he had imagined. He couldn't ignore this warning, not now. "Where did you hear this?" he asked urgently. The boy hesitated. "I'm not lying. I heard it on the shortwave radio. It's not a joke. They're going to kill you." A chill ran through him. He knew what he had to do. "Come with me," Traoré said, his voice low but firm. "We need to go now." The boy blinked, confused. "But I can't—" "I'm not asking," Traoré said, cutting him off. "You may have just saved my life." Traoré's heart pounded as he hurried through the back streets of Ouagadougou. The convoy was waiting, but this was no ordinary drive. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, only the hum of the engines and the occasional glance between the guards. The young boy, Ismail, sat nervously beside him in the back of the SUV, gripping his broken recorder tightly. He had been quiet ever since Traoré had taken him from the market, but the weight of the situation was heavy on both of them. "Is this real?" the boy asked quietly, still looking out the window, trying to make sense of the turn his life had just taken. Traoré smiled, though the tension in his chest made it difficult. Yes, it's real. You're sitting next to the man they're trying to kill. Ismail looked at him, wide-eyed. What now? We wait, Traoré replied. We need to catch them in the act. As the vehicle sped through the side streets, Traoré's mind raced. The meeting tonight, the one the traitors planned to use as the cover for their attack, was crucial. He had to be there. If he didn't show up, they would know he was on to them. His thoughts were interrupted by one of his guards, who leaned forward from the front seat. Sir, we need a plan. They won't try anything unless they know you'll be there. If you miss the meeting, they'll know we're on to them. I have to go, Traoré said, his jaw set. If I don't show up, we lose the element of surprise. The convoy made a sharp turn and began heading toward the presidential palace. But Traoré wasn't looking out the window. His mind was already in the council room, calculating every move, every moment. It was nearly 11 p.m. when President Ibrahim Traoré arrived at the council room. He had made it past the first wave of guards, past the locked doors, and into the heart of the palace. But something felt off. The air was thick with tension, and he could feel the eyes of his most trusted men on him, as if they too knew the stakes. Traoré entered the room with a calmness that betrayed the chaos brewing just beneath the surface. His ministers and security officers were already present, greeting him with formal salutes and polite smiles. But Traoré knew better. He could feel the weight of betrayal hanging in the air. He scanned the room, looking for signs of the men who had plotted against him. His eyes landed on the Minister of Defense, seated at the far end of the table. The same voice he had heard on the tape earlier. The traitor. But Traoré didn't make a move. Not yet. He took his seat, but his mind was focused on one thing: surviving the night. He had a plan, but it would require patience. Let's begin, Traoré said, his voice steady, calm, but with an undercurrent of something more. We have much to discuss. As the meeting began, the ministers and high-ranking officers settled into their chairs. The room was formal, silent, except for the rustle of papers and the soft clink of glasses. The security detail was stationed just outside, watching, listening. Traoré could feel their presence, but he knew that the real threat was already inside the room. He had no need for paranoia, just the cold certainty that something wasn't right. The Minister of Defense, seated across from him, glanced up occasionally, his eyes darting around the room as if calculating his next move. The other ministers exchanged pleasantries, their voices low, as if they were all unaware of the danger that loomed over the room. Traoré's thoughts were focused on one thing: the tape, the one that had come from the young boy in the market, the recording of betrayal, the voices of the very men who had once sworn allegiance to him. It played over and over in his mind. He must be gone before morning. Tonight, when he meets the council, we have people inside. The guards will be ours. The words echoed in his mind. He could feel the tension building in the room, and his instincts told him to act quickly. Every second counted. But Traoré remained still, his face calm, betraying nothing. His eyes scanned the faces of his trusted advisers, his ministers. All the while, a plan was forming in the back of his mind. He knew exactly what he had to do. But now, it was about timing. Suddenly, the door to the council room opened, and one of his senior security officers stepped inside, his face pale. "Sir," the officer said, his voice strained. "There's a situation. One of our men has gone rogue. He's left the building." Traoré's heart raced, but he didn't show it. He stood slowly, his eyes never leaving the Minister of Defense, who seemed too calm, too composed. He knew what he had to do. "Prepare the room," he said to the officer. "We need to move fast." The officers outside were ready. Traoré had made arrangements. They had been tracking every movement, every whispered conversation, every suspicious act. The traitors had no idea that their own movements had been watched, their every word recorded. As the officer hurried out, Traoré addressed the room with a calmness that betrayed none of the rising tension inside him. "Gentlemen, "I've heard enough," he said, his voice steady, but with an edge of authority that made everyone freeze. The room fell silent. "You think you can fool me?" Traoré continued, his eyes narrowing at the Minister of Defense. The man shifted slightly in his seat, but said nothing. "You think I wouldn't know?" He stood, the weight of his presence filling the room. "I know about the plot," he said simply. The silence was deafening. A cold sweat began to bead on the forehead of the Minister of Defense. His eyes darted around the room, as if searching for a way out, but Traoré's gaze was unyielding. He had been betrayed, but now it was time for the traitors to face the consequences of their actions. "You've been playing a dangerous game," Traoré continued, his voice low but cutting. "But you've forgotten one thing. I'm always a step ahead." At that moment, a loud crackle came from the earpiece in Traoré's ear. He didn't flinch. His men were in position. The trap was set. The room was still. The tension palpable. The Minister of Defense, now sweating, shifted in his seat, unable to maintain the facade of calm. His hands clenched tightly in his lap, his knuckles white. "Gentlemen," Traoré said, his voice cold now, "I want you to look closely at these men." He motioned to the traitors standing behind him, their faces now clearly visible to everyone in the room. The traitors, once men of honor, now stood in chains, their heads lowered in shame. "This is what happens when you betray your own country," Traoré said, his voice now steady and commanding. "You will face justice, just as these men will." The crowd, his ministers, his guards, watched in stunned silence as the traitors were led away. The Minister of Defense made one last desperate attempt to plead. "I didn't," he began, but Traoré's cold gaze silenced him instantly. "No more words," Traoré said firmly. "You will answer for your actions." The room was filled with the sharp sound of guards shuffling forward, their footsteps heavy against the floor. No one spoke. No one dared to interrupt the president. As the traitors were escorted out, Traoré turned to his remaining ministers. His eyes were dark, his face unreadable. "Let this be a lesson," he said, his voice now steady and commanding. "Burkina Faso will never kneel to anyone. We stand tall, and anyone who forgets that will face the same fate as these men." The following morning, the streets of Ouagadougou buzzed with an unusual energy. News of the betrayal had spread like wildfire. Rumors turned into confirmed reports. The ministers, who had once walked with pride, their heads held high, now cowered in shame. But Traoré said nothing. He did not need to. Across the city, people gathered around radios, huddled around televisions, eager to hear what the president would say. The moment had arrived. But instead of making a grand speech, Traoré chose something different. He appeared on national television, not in the opulence of the presidential palace, but in the heart of the city, standing in front of a crowd of ordinary Burkinabe citizens. "I am here," he began, his voice calm, "to remind you of one truth. We are free, we are sovereign, and we will never again bow to foreign powers. Not now, not ever." The crowd erupted in applause. There were no speeches filled with empty promises. There was no rhetoric, no grandstanding. Just the simple, unshakable truth that the people of Burkina Faso were no longer willing to be manipulated. "This is our country," Traoré continued, his voice steady. "We stand tall, and we will protect our sovereignty at all costs. Anyone who tries to steal that from us will be exposed, and they will fall." As the sun set over Ouagadougou, the weight of the day hung heavy in the air. The traitors had been exposed, the plot had been foiled, and President Ibrahim Traoré stood firm, unshaken, resolute. His actions, though quiet and measured, had sent a message to the world. And that message was simple. Burkina Faso would no longer be anyone's pawn. As the cameras rolled, the crowd chanted his name. They weren't just cheering for a man, they were cheering for a new era, one where Africa stood in its own power, free from the control of foreign forces. The world had been watching, and it had witnessed something profound. Not a leader shouting, but a leader who stood silently, his actions speaking louder than words. And in that silence, the people of Burkina Faso found their strength,